In the spring of 1952, a scientist made one of the most important photographs in the history of human civilization. She did not know that yet. She was just doing her job, carefully, methodically, the way she always did everything. 2 years later, two men in another building at another university used that photograph, without her knowledge, without her permission, and without any intention of ever telling her, to win the Nobel Prize. This is not a story about a woman who was overlooked. Overlooked is when someone forgets to say thank you. This is a story about a deliberate, documented, institutional decision to erase a scientist from the discovery that bears other people's names. And we are going to go through it, step by step, with the evidence in front of us. Rosalind Elsie Franklin was born in Notting Hill, London, on July 25, 1920. From the earliest records that exist about her, there is a consistent pattern. She was precise. She was methodical. She did not guess. She measured. Her school reports describe a girl who does not accept an answer unless she can verify it herself. She won a scholarship to Newnham College at Cambridge at 18. This was not easy for women in 1938. The university did not officially grant women full degrees until 1948. She studied chemistry in a system that had spent centuries designing itself around her exclusion. She graduated at the top of her class, regardless. During World War II, she did not retreat into private life. She researched the internal structure of coal for the British Coal Utilisation Research Association. This is not glamorous work. It is measuring, charting, and understanding the physical properties of carbon at a molecular level. She was 22. She published 4 research papers before she was 26. In 1947, she moved to Paris to work at the Laboratoire Central des Services Chimiques de l'État. It was the best decision she ever made, and she would spend the rest of her career trying to recreate what she found there. She learned X-ray crystallography. This is a technique that uses beams of X-rays to determine the atomic and molecular structure of a crystal. When done correctly, it does not speculate. It reveals. It was the most precise analytical tool available at the time. And Rosalind Franklin became one of the best people in the world at using it. In January 1951, she accepted a research fellowship at King's College London. Her specific assignment: use X-ray crystallography to study the structure of DNA. At this point in history, scientists knew DNA existed. They knew it carried genetic information. What nobody knew was what it looked like, what its three-dimensional structure was. That structure was everything. If you knew the structure, you knew the mechanism. If you knew the mechanism, you understood how life itself reproduced and transmitted information. The answer to that question was going to change biology, medicine, and our understanding of what we are as living organisms. The race to find it was the most important scientific competition of the century. And Rosalind Franklin was in it, not as a supporting character, but as the most technically capable person working on the problem. But something happened at King's College that had nothing to do with science, and it would cost her everything. From the moment she arrived at King's College, the environment was designed to make her fail. Not through overt hostility, though there was that too, but through the quiet, structural contempt that institutions deploy against people they were not built for. The senior common room at King's College, where researchers gathered for lunch and conversation, and the informal exchange of ideas that drives scientific progress, was closed to women. Rosalind Franklin could not eat there. She could not sit in the room where the most important discussions in her department happened. This was not a technicality. This was daily, deliberate, architectural exclusion. Her situation was further complicated by the man she was supposed to work with. Maurice Wilkins was a senior researcher at King's College who had also been studying DNA. The institutional arrangement was never made entirely clear to either of them. Wilkins believed Franklin had been assigned as his assistant. Franklin had been told she was an independent researcher with her own project and her own authority over it. They had been placed in the same building with a fundamental misunderstanding at the center of their relationship, and nobody corrected it. They worked in a state of barely concealed friction for the entirety of her time at King's College. Despite this, Franklin worked. She improved the X-ray crystallography equipment. She developed better techniques for preparing DNA samples. She was meticulous in a way that her contemporaries, looking back years later, described as close to obsessive. She wanted data that was undeniable. She wanted images so clear that no interpretation would be required. The molecule would simply reveal itself. In May 1952, she produced what she later noted in her personal records as a particularly clear image. She called it, in her filing system, Photograph 51. It showed, with extraordinary precision, the X-ray diffraction pattern of a hydrated form of DNA. If you knew how to read it, and Rosalind Franklin did, it told you almost everything you needed to know about the structure of the molecule. She knew what she was looking at. She began the methodical work of calculating the exact structural dimensions from the data in the image. She did not rush. She did not announce. She worked. At that same moment, 50 miles north in Cambridge, two men were working on the same problem. Not in a laboratory, not with equipment. They were building models. Paper and wire and metal, arranged and rearranged, trying to guess the shape of a molecule they had never directly studied themselves. James Watson was 23 years old. Francis Crick was 35. Neither of them was a specialist in X-ray crystallography. Both of them were brilliant, and both of them were aware of the work happening at King's College. They were watching from a distance, waiting. But the moment that changed everything was not in a laboratory. It was in a hallway. And it was not Rosalind Franklin who made the decision that cost her everything. In January 1953, James Watson traveled to King's College. He was there to speak with Maurice Wilkins. What happened in that meeting, and precisely what was shown to Watson, has been debated, denied, and documented for 60 years. What is not in dispute is this. Maurice Wilkins showed James Watson photograph 51. He did not ask Franklin's permission. He did not tell her he had done it. She was in the same building. He showed it to Watson without her knowledge. Watson, in his own written account, describes the moment he saw the photograph. He writes that his mouth fell open. He writes that the instant he saw the picture, his pulse began to race. He understood immediately what the image was telling him about the structure of DNA. He had been guessing for months. In one moment, looking at someone else's data without her consent, the guess became certainty. He returned to Cambridge. Within weeks, Watson and Crick had built the correct model of DNA's double helix structure. They published their findings in Nature magazine on April 25, 1953. The paper was 4 pages long. It proposed the double helix. It acknowledged, in a single sentence, that they had been stimulated by a knowledge of the general nature of the unpublished experimental results of researchers at King's College. One sentence. That was the acknowledgement. In that same issue of Nature, Rosalind Franklin's work was published, third, in a supporting position, as though it were additional evidence for Watson and Crick's discovery rather than the primary data on which the discovery was built. The editorial arrangement was not accidental. It was a decision that established a hierarchy. Watson and Crick had found something, and Franklin's data confirmed it. That was the story Nature chose to tell. It was not what had happened. But none of this came out in 1953. Because there was something else working against Rosalind Franklin, something even more structural than one stolen photograph. In 1953, Rosalind Franklin left King's College. The environment had become untenable. She moved to Birkbeck College in London, where she began new research on the structure of viruses. By all accounts, including the accounts of colleagues who worked alongside her there, she was relieved. She was doing important work. She had moved away from the institutional hostility of King's College and into a laboratory where she was valued. She did not know that her photograph had been shown to Watson. She did not know the full extent to which her data had driven their model. Watson and Crick had published. The world had accepted their framing. The conversation had moved on, and Rosalind Franklin was not part of it. In 1956, she was diagnosed with ovarian cancer. She continued to work through 2 surgeries and multiple rounds of treatment. Her colleagues at Birkbeck describe a woman who showed up, who delivered, who did not perform illness and did not allow illness to become the subject of her professional relationships. She published 6 papers while undergoing treatment. 6 papers. On April 16, 1958, Rosalind Franklin died. She was 37 years old. The cancer had been aggressive. The treatment available at the time was insufficient. She did not know, she could not have known, that 4 years later, in 1962, James Watson, Francis Crick, and Maurice Wilkins would stand in Stockholm to receive the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for the discovery of the structure of DNA. The Nobel Prize is not awarded posthumously. That is a formal rule of the Nobel Foundation. Rosalind Franklin had been dead for 4 years when the prize was given. Whether she would have been included if she had lived, whether the Nobel Committee would have been willing to give the prize to the woman whose data had been used without her consent, is a question that history chose not to answer. What is not a question? Her data was foundational. The image she produced, photograph 51, was the clearest evidence available for the double helix structure. Watson has said this in public, in recorded interviews, in his own written account. He has not always said it with the remorse the statement might call for, but he has said it. When Watson published his memoir in 1968, it described Rosalind Franklin in terms that her colleagues found, and find, to this day, difficult to read without anger. He referred to her by her first name. He described her appearance. He described her as difficult, uncooperative, proprietary about her data. He called her Rosie, a nickname she never used and never would have answered to. Her former supervisor at Cambridge, J.D. Bernal, wrote that she was among the best X-ray crystallographers of her day. The Nobel laureate Aaron Klug, who worked with her at Birkbeck, said her contributions to the DNA discovery were not just significant but essential. The Royal Society, which had not admitted her as a fellow while she lived, named a prize after her in 2008. The prize is for women in science. Rosalind Franklin never received the prize. She never stood in Stockholm. She never gave an acceptance speech. She died at 37, having completed some of the most precise and important experimental work in the history of molecular biology, having been denied the credit for it while alive, and having been, by design, by institution, by the deliberate decisions of specific individuals, erased from the story that her own hands had made possible. Photograph 51 is not Watson's photograph. It is not Crick's photograph. It is not Wilkins's photograph. It is hers. It will always be hers. And the fact that it took 70 years for that to be stated plainly, publicly, and without the qualification that Watson's defenders still reach for, that is not a footnote to this story. That is the story. Every week, this channel is going to do exactly what was just done. We are going to take a name that history buried, and we are going to say it out loud, with the documents, with the evidence, without the version that was designed to make you look elsewhere. If you want to know who they erased next, subscribe now. And if you want to know which file we open next week, it involves a man who built the foundation of the internet. His name appears on nothing. The company that used his work is worth $400 billion. That episode drops in 7 days.